So hello everyone, on behalf of the team at the Mount Gambier Library, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us on Zoom tonight. Firstly, I'd like you to join me as we acknowledge the Boandik peoples as the traditional custodians of the land of the Mount Gambier Library, and many of you are on today. We respect their spiritual relationship with this land and the deep feelings of attachment our Indigenous people have with this land. Now tonight we are pleased to bring to you from the comfort of your home, Hugh Mackay, with his latest book, The Inner Self, and the joy of discovering who we really are. This night has been made possible thanks to Dr. Barney McCusker, who back before COVID caused all this havoc, had kindly made contact with Hugh, and Hugh was due to join us in person, but unfortunately that's impossible at the moment. So I hope you're all comfy. You've got a cuppa or a glass of wine. And before we start, I'd just like to say that throughout the evening in the Q&A box, you can type your questions. We will hold on to those until the end of the evening just to keep the pace going. But I'll be looking at those and Barney will be looking at those at the end. You can type those in at any time and we'll address those at the end of the session. So for now, I'd like to hand you over to your MC for this evening, Dr. Barney McCusker.
Christy, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Boandik people. I'd like to add my own thanks, and I'm wearing my favourite Aboriginal tie tonight. Hugh Mackay, thank you very much for coming. Hugh's a social researcher and best-selling author of 21 books, and he's got a few more coming down the line. He has had a 60-year career in social research and was a weekly columnist for over 25 years. Among the many honorary appointments, he's been the Deputy Chairman of the Australia Council for the Arts, Chairman of Trustees of the Sydney Grammar School, the inaugural Chairman of the ACT Government's Community Inclusion Body, and an Honorary Professor at Macquarie, Wollongong and Charles Sturt Universities. He is currently a patron of the Asylum Seekers Centre. Hugh is a Fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and the Royal Society of New South Wales. In recognition of his pioneering work in social research, he has been awarded honorary doctorates at Charles Sturt, Macquarie, New South Wales, Western Sydney and Wollongong Universities. He was appointed an officer in the Order of Australia in 2015. And that's the thumbnail sketch of our guest tonight. So Hugh, with 21 books to your name, where did the inner self come from? I'm presuming from your inner self.
Yes, from some deep reflection stimulated by a publisher who did say to me, look, you've spent your writing career and your research career studying society and how people have responded to social change. Maybe it's time to turn the focus inward. And that sparked a lot of reflection, a lot of thought. And I thought, yes, it's true. I've been dealing as a social psychologist, of course, I've been dealing with people mostly from the point of view of their relationships with each other, their sort of external persona. But there is another persona. There is the inner self, and I thought towards the end, not at the end, but towards the end of my writing career, probably not a bad idea to take a look at this other tradition in psychology and philosophy of the idea that there's a self within us, as well as the self that we present to the world.
The burning question, who actually am I, came from an age anytime, though not just trauma and suffering, but through joy, birth, love, and promotion. That's a quote from your book. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think mostly we don't just spontaneously think, oh, it's time I took a look inside and got in touch with my inner life and tried to decide who is the real Barney, or who is the real Hugh, or who is the real Christy. I think it usually takes a trigger. Now, for many people, that trigger is the famous midlife crisis, where people come to the middle of their lives and they think, now, is this all there is? Is this all I'm going to do? Is this all I will become? is there not something else about me that I haven't fully got fully in touch with yet? For some people, though, as you said from that quote, sometimes it is a trauma. For some people, it will undoubtedly be the pandemic, which has stimulated a lot of self-reflection and introspection. For some people, it's an illness or a retrenchment. I began the book with a little story about the British actor Emma Thompson, who came to this moment on the eve of her 60th birthday. And she said on the eve of her 60th birthday, it suddenly occurred to her that she could take away all the masks that she was wearing, all the roles that society had handed her, daughter, mother, wife, actor, celebrity. She could peel all that away and ask herself the question, lying behind all of those roles, who am I really? And by the way, she said something which I think will probably resonate with a lot of our audience tonight, Barney, which is that for most of her life, she thought that was a really boring question. And then when she got to this point, a bit later than for most people, to her 60th birthday, she suddenly found it the most riveting question she could think of.
For those of our audience who would like Emma Thompson, and I think that would be the majority, could I recommend a movie called Remains of the Day? It's one of her best movies ever with Hopkins, but that's just a little editorial there. Now, early in the book, you suggest the more we understand ourselves, the better equipped we are to lead a meaningful, purposeful life. How's that so?
Yeah, this goes back to the ancient Greeks, really, Barney, who they had this slogan, really, know thyself. And the idea was, until you are in touch with your real self, with your inner authentic self, then you can't live a full, rich, authentic life. The sense of, and we'll come to this in a moment perhaps, but the sense of the meaning and the purpose of your life really depends on getting in touch with this inner authentic you. So anything other than that is a kind of half-life. I mean, if we're just staying on the surface, if we're doing, as Emma, I mean, you can understand why Emma Thompson was trapped in those roles, because she is a very fine actor, and she really is a global celebrity. A bit hard to take that mask away and say, now, if I'm not Emma the actor, if I'm not Emma the global celebrity, or indeed Emma the mother or the wife, what am I? You can understand why people might want to postpone that, but her feeling was, if she did step away from those roles, take off those masks, there would be something important to discover about the inner Emma.
Is this what a lot of actors like in being able to play someone else? They get to play that person who is not them for a time, and then put that person back. And does that teach them a little bit more of who they are or who they do not want to be?
Yes, it's very interesting to hear. One of my kids is an actor. It's very interesting to hear actors talking about this very point. And a very typical thing that actors will say is that it's much easier to get into a role than it is to get out of it. Because once you're in it and you're kind of living the part, it's quite hard at the end of a performance, if it's a stage play, or at the end of the shooting, if it's a movie, it's quite hard to shed all that and go back to who you are. And it's not always clear who you are after you've been that other person. Peter Sellers, many people said, who worked with Peter Sellers over the decades when he was a star, that he never had the faintest idea who he was. He was only ever the parts he played, which of course he played brilliantly. So I think it's probably harder for actors to get inside their own selves because they wear so many masks.
Anthony Hopkins once said, after he had played Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, for which he got an Academy Award, and he was only actually on screen for 13 minutes. It's the shortest person ever to be on screen and still get an Academy Award. He said, I will never play that person again. And then, of course, they offered him so much money that he did go and play him again.
Yes.
He
Yes.
didn't really want to do it.
No.
I'll be back on script. Talk us through exploring the difference between the outer and the inner self.
Well, if we have a book called The Inner Self, that implies that there must be an outer self, and indeed there is. The outer self refers to the way we appear to people, and it's the aspect of the self that most of us are primarily concerned with in the first half of our lives, kind of establishing our place in the world. It's to do with our roles and responsibilities. I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a social researcher, I'm a chorister, I'm a writer. All these things, I drive this kind of car, I wear these sort of clothes, I talk like this. All of these things are like my image that I project to the world, the way in which I establish an identity. Now, this word identity, which has become very fashionable, everyone who wants to talk about their identity, and that leads on to things like identity politics, where we have groups in the community very concerned to have their particular identity respected. Now, the thing about our social identity, the outer shell that we present to the world, is that it's all about the differences between us. That's what I mean, identity, the very word says that's how we identify people. That's how we tell the difference between Barney and Hugh. Barney's identity and Hugh's identity are different enough for us to be able to say they're not the same bloke. I can tell them from 10 paces. And that's how it is with the whole subject of identity. Now, the inner self has got nothing to do with that outer shell. And as I mentioned, often when we reach a time like a midlife crisis or some other critical moment in our lives, we often think, well, yeah, I am all those things. Of course, I'm not going to give up being all those things, let alone be a man or have my particular ethnicity or whatever it is. But there is more. And when we start to go in, this is sort of the central paradox of the book, Barney. Because the outer self is, as I've just suggested, all about the differences between us, our identity. But the inner self, when we go deeply inside ourselves in search of our true, authentic nature, what we find is our common humanity. What we find is that our inner self is all about how we are the same, not how we're different. And that, I think, is initially that might strike people as a bit odd, a bit of a struggle to see it. Surely when we go deeply inside ourselves, we find our unique identity. Well, no, our unique identity is the outer one. That's where we're unique. That's where we're different. And that's all about independence. But when we get into the inner self, when we discover what it means to be a human, when we discover the authentic human self, we discover that it's about our interdependence, not our independence. So that's where the idea of common humanity comes from.
Talking about projecting that outer self, all of us for 8 years were intimately aware of Barack Obama on a nightly basis, and he projected an outer self. Do you think that by projecting that outer self, he was actually letting us into his inner self? Because he was one of the most genuine, moving public speakers I've ever seen my whole life.
Yes, and I think we'll perhaps come to this, but Obama is a very nice example of what happens when you have been on the inner journey, and his own autobiographical writings indicate that he has. That you get in touch with your authentic inner self and it starts to show, so that the exterior presentation doesn't go away. He's still male. He's still got the ethnicity that he's got. He's still Michelle's husband, and he's still the father of those kids, and he's still a former president and all that. But there's something about the inner self that comes through, about his sense of his own deep humanity that comes through in so much of his public presentation. It's a very nice example to use.
We talk about that common humanity. So what is that core of self?
Yeah, this gets us absolutely to the essence of the book, Barney, because when we go deeply into ourselves and start thinking about the human nature we have, that reminds us that we belong to a particular kind of species. We call them humans. Sometimes we call them Homo sapiens. That's a bit of an exaggeration. We're not all that wise. But we call our species, we call human. And like many other species on the planet, we are a social species. That's the essential thing we need to know about what it means to be human. Now, what that means in turn is that being human, we are hopeless in isolation. We can't survive on our own. We need each other. We need families, we need neighborhoods, we need colleagues, we need football teams, choirs, book clubs, local communities. All of those things are how humans operate because we are so utterly interdependent, even though we are simultaneously independent via our external identity. Now, the next step in that process is to say, well, if it's the case that I belong to a social species which utterly depends for its survival on our ability to create harmonious social groups that will function and nurture and sustain us, then obviously my primary responsibility as a human is to treat other humans kindly and respectfully and tolerantly and inclusively. In other words, what we discover when we look deeply inside ourselves is that we have both a responsibility to be compassionate, but also the capacity to be compassionate. The core quality of the human person is our capacity to cooperate, to build harmonious communities, etc. Because, putting it at its simplest, we are loving creatures. That's who we are. At our essence, we have this capacity to show compassion.
I've always thought, my understanding was Homo sapiens, 160,000 years, the three things that define us are our use of fire, our use of technology, and we're devoted to our technology, as we can see tonight, and our ability to love and care for each other.
Yes.
Is that really just go through the ages and through all humanity? Is that how you would see it?
That's exactly how I'd see it, Barney. That's a very interesting trio of qualities to identify, but for the purposes of this discussion, yes, our capacity to be, I mean, when we use the word love, depending where you are in the life cycle, a lot of people think romantic love or the love of family or friends and so on, but there is this other kind of quintessential human love, which allows us to show compassion even towards people we don't like much. Now, this is one of the most wonderful things about human nature. We are capable of showing kindness, compassion towards total strangers, or towards people that we don't like, towards people we don't agree with and could never agree with about politics or religion or taste in music or something else. But being human, we have this capacity that we don't always exercise, of course, but we have the capacity to do this wonderful, unique human thing.
So why is it that we're so reluctant to face the truth about who we really are?
Well, let's just pause for a moment and think about this capacity we have for compassion. We've been saying how wonderful it is. It brings out the best in us. It's humans at their noblest, etc. But of course, it's a responsibility and it's a burden. It's not always easy to be compassionate. It's not always easy to be kind towards someone that you're feeling cranky with. It's not always easy to show respect towards someone that you're feeling contemptuous of. It's often easier not to show compassion. It's love's work is the hardest work of all. Anyone who's been married for a long time knows that. It doesn't just happen. You work at it because the thing is grounded in love and you want to maintain it. And that's true about not just about an intimate relationship like a marriage or a partnership, but it's true about a neighborhood. It's true about an extended family. It's true about strangers we meet on the bus. That's a responsibility we have that we sometimes want to shy away from. It's like in our moral life, there are many occasions I'm sure we've all experienced where I know what the right thing to do is, but I'm not going to do it because I've got some other desire that's more powerful than the desire to do the right thing. I'm driven by a particular ambition or a particular lust or a desire for a particular thing that I want to spend too much money on or whatever it might be. We humans are constantly caught between wanting to do the right thing and wanting to not do the right thing. But our quality is that we know what the right thing is. And the same here, we know what the loving, compassionate, kind, respectful thing to do is. And sometimes it's quite a big ask. It's quite tough. And not surprisingly, we slide away from it a bit. And I think there's a metaphor which I use in the book, Barney, which is to think of ourselves as a kind of personal solar system. Think of our capacity for love, compassion, kindness, respect, tolerance, all those things as like the light at the center of our solar system that energizes us and warms us and illuminates us. In fact, I think this whole process we're talking about of discovering the inner self is like the moment of personal enlightenment. So light's a good word. But of course, all bright light casts shadows. And our capacity for love casts shadows within. We say in our folklore, don't we? There's often a very fine line between love and hate. Sometimes the person you love most, you can feel intense hostility towards. Where did that come from? It came from the brightness of the love, which cast the shadows. And sometimes it's easier to slink off and hide in the shadows than to stay.
How do we manage being confronted by the dark stuff that we sometimes confront within ourselves and in life?
Yeah, and we're all going to find it. I mean, one of the things that I report in the book is the number of people who actually resist the inner journey, actually resist getting in touch with their inner self because they're afraid of the dark stuff. They say, look, I know, there's a bit of a mess inside me. I don't think I want to know. I don't want to go in there and discover that I've got a lot of anger or I've got a lot of jealousy or I've got this potential for hatred. Now, we've all got that. And I think the thing that should encourage us to go inside ourselves, in spite of knowing there's dark stuff there, is that the dark stuff is there because of the light. We're all light and dark. We're all a struggle between good and evil, if you like. So it's not only dark stuff. There's other stuff there as well. And we will be more complete, more authentic humans if we have confronted and accepted that we do have the dark stuff inside us and understood why it's there.
You do devote a lot of the book to the ways we manage to hide the truth from ourselves. Can you explain some of the specific or common hiding places that we go to hide that truth? Yes.
I've got a big chunk in the center of the book, which I call our top 20 hiding places. We won't talk about all 20 now, but yeah, there are some pretty obvious ones, like the pursuit of happiness is a favorite hiding place. It's a crazy thing that people sometimes fall for the idea that the goal of life is to be happy, that we're all supposed to be happy all the time. If you're not happy, there's something wrong with you. So go and take a drug or pop a pill or have a drink or fall in love or do something to get yourself happy again. It's a form of madness because we know that happiness only makes sense because it's one of a spectrum of emotions that are available. If you'd never been sad, you wouldn't know what happiness was. I mean, if I could bestow on you, Barney, for the rest of your life, the guarantee that you'll always be happy, then of course you'd never be happy because that's happiness is a contrasting emotion. It only makes sense because of the context. But the other thing about happiness is that, or about our spectrum of emotions, is that every point on the spectrum has something to teach us about who we are, about what it means to be human. And I think anyone over the age of about 15 has discovered that actually the so-called dark emotions, loss, disappointment, failure, sadness, have much more to teach us about who we really are than these lovely moments. I'm not against happiness. I love being happy as much as anyone, but they're moments that visit us. It's an ephemeral state, and it doesn't have much to teach us. Now, if we commit ourselves, so in the book, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with happiness. The problem is the pursuit of happiness. If we commit ourselves to pursuing happiness, pursuing pleasure, as though everything has to feel good, and if I'm not feeling good, there's something wrong and I'll have to do something in order to get back the feeling of happiness, that's going to be a hiding place. That's going to be a distraction from going into our deep inner self, where we discover that our responsibility is towards other people. Mahatma Gandhi said something very wise, which I've quoted in the book. The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. Well, the service of others isn't necessarily a passport to happiness. It's certainly a good way of finding yourself, and it's certainly a good way of getting deep life satisfaction. But for example, any parent will tell you, being a parent is a source of enormous life satisfaction, adds rich meaning to your life, but it's not all fun and games. It's not a source of happiness necessarily. In fact, I saw some research published by a Harvard researcher a couple of years ago who said parents are at their happiest when they are away from their children. I don't know whether that's true. But anyway, so in other words, there's more to life than that. A sense of meaning, the satisfaction that comes from being in touch with our authentic inner self has nothing to do with pursuing happiness as a way of life or as a goal of life.
There's a subgroup in our society, and they're called goths, and they dress darkly and they wear dark makeup, etc. And they never look happy. Are they got a lot of happiness coming down the highway of life later on?
Yes, they'll certainly know it when it hits them. It'll be a sharp contrast. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've never got deeply inside goth culture, but if you were going to be strictly logical about all this, and you said I'm devoted to the idea of happiness as the goal of my life, then you'd have to seek ways of being sad in order to get the contrast. It's logical nonsense. Another favourite hiding place, by the way, of course, at the moment, and it's one worth mentioning because we're using the technology, but information technology is another hiding place. Many people hide in their smartphones. Now, the technology has been the saving of us during the pandemic, when we were not able to have personal contact with all the people we'd like to see. But when your life is distracted, when your life is focused, when you can't bear to turn your phone off or even just be more than a metre away from it, when every spare moment is spent scrolling through your phone, when you're constantly messaging, that becomes a huge distraction. Because of course, it's constant stimulation, and constant stimulation is the enemy of introspection.
Tell me, will some people who read this book find this book confronting?
I think that's probably a fair comment, Barney. In fact, when I was writing it, I was talking to a friend about what I was writing, and he said, boy, that's a bit of a challenging theme for a book. I think some people will find it confronting because we do have this, particularly when we're younger, I think we do have this natural reluctance to worry too much about what's going on inside. We're more concerned with the externals and the outer identity. But I think the answer for people who are feeling a bit confronted by the idea of the inner self is that it's basically good news. I mean, what we're going to discover about ourselves is a wonderful thing, surrounded by less wonderful stuff, sure. But until we go inside and discover what human nature is, and how we can live in a way that's truer to our human nature will remain incomplete. So the promise of the book is, here's a way to become a more authentic, more complete person. And that won't only benefit you, that'll benefit all the people who love you, the people you work with, the people you encounter, because you'll be a bit like the Obama example you gave us, Barney, that you'll be a more authentic, accessible, transparent person.
Just going back to Obama, the one time I saw it break down, but in a good way, was when he was reporting on Sandy Hook. And that was a truly shattering moment for the world when all those children were killed.
Yes.
And that's when we saw past the mask that he projected so well for so many years. And the real, I mean, that was a tragic situation, Sandy Hook, but the real tragedy came a few weeks later, when despite Sandy Hook, he could not get gun control through the American Senate.
Yes.
And that must have been just absolutely shattering for him.
Yes.
Is that how you read it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think his response to the Sandy Hook massacre itself, and his response to the failure of the US Congress to pass the proposed gun laws, were a glimpse again into the authentic Obama. I mean, he was heartbroken. He was, as you said, shattered by this. And that's, of course, authentic. That's his human nature responding to something that really challenges the idea that we are a compassionate species. How could a member of a compassionate species do something as appalling as that? Well, of course, sometimes the shadows overwhelm the light and you get this appalling behavior. But the thing to cling to, I think, always is that the capacity for compassion is there in everyone. And part of our responsibility, I think, as citizens, part of our responsibility as residents of Mount Gambier, as members of this community, is to encourage the capacity for compassion in others, starting with our kids.
So how do we practice being our authentic self?
I think it's a daily discipline, you know. I think compassion, I should say one other thing about compassion, perhaps to explain, to answer your question properly. Compassion is not about emotion. Compassion is not about affection. Other kinds of love are emotional and are to do with affection. But compassion is that one unique variety of love which says, I'm capable of acting well, I'm capable of showing kindness and respect towards, as I said earlier, towards people I don't like much or I don't agree with. That's the noblest form of human love. That form of compassion. So that's a discipline that we exercise. We have to remind ourselves that that's our true nature, and we need to come back to it and not be distracted by all these hiding places and shadows and so on. And I think part of the daily discipline of being a compassionate person is once a day, probably the evening is the time to do it, to spend a moment in reflection on the events of the day and say, was I true to myself? Was I the authentic, compassionate person that I know I'm capable of being? Or did I fall short when I blew my stack at someone, or where I failed to stop and help someone who obviously needed a hand? Why did I do that? I think that little checking in as a daily discipline of reflection is going to go a long way towards helping us to be true to ourselves.
Hugh, what you've given us in this book is a tool. So how do we put this book and this tool that you've given us into practice and help us be better people, better in our lives, better in our families, better in our communities?
Well, if we go back to my use of the word enlightenment, I think once we get the insight, I'm not expecting that everybody will instantly buy this. But once we get the insight, it's typically a midlife kind of thing, or even a second half of life, but plenty of wonderful young people come to this early in their life. Once we get the insight that this is what it means to be human, we're on our way, because really there is no escape from that realization once we've made it. I want to be, now I understand what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a member of a family, a neighborhood, a community, a library staff, a butcher, whatever it is that I am. I can do all of that in a way that is tinged by compassion, by human kindness. Even when I have, this is not going soft, by the way. This doesn't mean we're going to be an emotional doormat. I can do all of this even if I have to be tough, even if I have to discipline someone, even if I have to terminate a relationship. It can all be done in a spirit of compassion and kindness.
Christy, I think we should open it up to our audience. Christy, have we got some questions out there?
Well, I invite anyone to type in at the moment in the little Q&A box down the bottom, but we do have one question, so I will pass that one over to you, Barney.
Cool. This is Hugh. This is a question without notice. It's from Greg. I think I might know Greg. Mindfulness teaches us that the self is an illusion. Is there any reconciling this wisdom with yours?
Well, there are two parallel or maybe contradictory philosophical traditions. One says there is such a thing as human nature, and we are at our most authentic when we are true to human nature, and that's our true self. By the way, when I talk about that, I don't mean therefore we discard our identity. The outer shell is still there. That's still part of who we are. But the other tradition says, no such thing as the self. The existentialists who rode high in the middle of the 20th century were saying, all there is behavior. All you need to know about someone is what do they do. We are nothing but our history. And that's a very appeal. I fell for that. I shouldn't say fell for it. I embraced that myself for a few years in early adulthood. But I've come to the view that there is an inner life because I experience it. But I accept that others don't. I mean, there's a famous school of psychology called behaviorism. B.F. Skinner will be a name that many of our audience will have heard of. And Skinner, though he was a psychologist, was completely dismissive of concepts like the mind, let alone the soul. For Skinner, there was only behavior. And his whole psychology was about why humans behave in the way they do and how we can modify their behavior with rewards and punishments and so on. He completely denied the idea of the self. So people will embrace that alternative, and I don't think it's easy to reconcile those two alternative views. But I think introspection, I think when you experience, for example, regret over something that you did that you wish you hadn't done, or failed to do that you wish you had done, I think that's a sign that you are in touch with something more than your outer shell. Whenever you experience indecision or doubt, I think that's a sign that there is an inner self operating which is challenging some aspects of your outer self.
One of my great privileges as a doctor is that my patients bring me great stories.
Yes.
Some of them hilarious. I've got to make sure I don't laugh because they're so funny. But one of the class of people that I treat were our soldiers. I treated World War I soldiers when I first came here.
Yep.
I treat a lot of World War II diggers. I treat a lot of Vietnam guys, Korean guys, guys from Rwanda. I'm very grateful that my generation of McCuskers were the first generation for 3 generations who didn't go to war. My grandfather went to, and his brothers went to the WW1. My father and his brothers went to WW2.
Yep.
Do you find that the soldiers who have been to war, who have faced the odd angry bullet, have actually sometimes have a fairly good understanding of their inner self because they've actually seen it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's an extreme example of trauma that would trigger some introspection. What's it all about? What am I doing here? What am I fighting for? What do I want to become? What do I want? How can I make the world a better place so this won't happen again? Many veterans do wrestle with those questions. And by the way, while we're just talking about war, I think it's important to say that people who lived through World War II, as you and I did, people who lived through the Great Depression, and we're a bit too young for that, reflected on those experiences, even if they weren't at war, but they were dealing with a society that was going through a lot of hardship and deprivation, and even more hardship and deprivation through the Great Depression of the early 30s. Most people who went through those experiences look back on them and say, that was the making of us. That caused us to reflect on what's really important to us, what kind of society we want, what kind of people we are. And I think reflection on the inner self is, in a way, the silver lining of a situation like having to live through a war or a depression or indeed a pandemic.
Well, we're living through a war right now. It's a war with Mother Nature, or Mother Nature's making war on us, and she's not there to be negotiated with. We have to live around her. She wants to live in us and kill a proportion of us. But this is an opportunity for the human race to actually look at ourselves and change our behaviour. What are the changes that you see that we could possibly make as a result of living with and surviving this pandemic?
Yes, the pandemic, I think, has done two important things for us. One, as you said, where Mother Nature has sent us the coronavirus. It's invading our species. By the way, it's a reminder of the fact that we are all one, that we are an indivisible, interdependent, interconnected species. The virus doesn't say I'll only invade Buddhists or I'll only invade rich people. Anyone that's human is fair game. And that's because we are a species. So it reminds us of our interconnectedness. Because of the lockdown, because of so much social isolation, we've had a lot more opportunity for introspection than we normally have. And I think there are going to be very distinct benefits coming out of this, Barney. I think for a start, we will value family and friends more highly because we've missed them. We will value the neighbourhood more highly. We'll recognise that in a moment of crisis, the neighbours are our immediate human setting. That's our, whether we like them or not, whether they're people like us or people very different from, they are our neighbours. I think we've sharpened up our sense of what it means to be a neighbour as a result of this pandemic. I think there's also been a lot of very deep rethinking going on about our level of materialism, our level of frantic busyness. I think the world has sort of pressed the pause button. And I keep hearing people say, it's actually been, I mean, a lot of people are experiencing loneliness and anguish about this, but for many people, it's been an opportunity to reflect on the sort of life they were leading, to say, did I really need to run so hard? Did I really need to be so busy? Do I really need to go on all those trips that I now can't go on? Did I really need to buy all that stuff that I now can't buy? And often the answer is no, I didn't need to do all those things. I could live a somewhat simpler, even a somewhat slower life, and probably be a more authentic person as a result.
I think the pandemic is an opportunity. If I might just editorialise here, it is highly infectious, so that two people can come into somewhere like Burnie, and within 7 to 10 days, it's 137. It's not terribly deadly unless you're an inmate or live in a retirement home, and then it gets very, very deadly. The death rate is about 2 to 3%, which is still high enough. But I tell you what, if the next bug that's coming down that biological highway, which is this infectious, but is as deadly as, say, smallpox was, which had a 90% death rate, yes. Well, we had better learn the the messages that this pandemic is teaching us now, exactly what you say, and also about godliness and cleanliness, etc.
Yes.
Because that's when it's going to become really, we'll get through this. I don't know if we're going to have a vaccine by Christmas like President Trump says we'll have, if not sooner. I don't think we're going to have that, but we have the opportunity to have lessons from it. But I think you're absolutely right. It's going to make us better people for going through this war. Now, do we have another question?
We do have another question. Jenny is asking, do you feel meditation is a way of getting in touch with our inner self?
Yes, thanks, Jenny. Absolutely. Meditation is probably the best way. I mean, it's a demonstrated thing, not just in Eastern mysticism, where a lot of meditation came from, but in other religious settings and in secular settings. Meditation is, as I was saying to Barney earlier, it's one of those things that can become a daily discipline where we do reflect deeply on who we are, what we want to become. And there's a particular branch of meditation called loving kindness meditation, which I've referred to in the book, which is where our meditation is focused on other people, encouraging us in our feelings of compassion towards other people, especially if we're a bit lacking. So I'm 100% endorsing meditation, mindfulness training, etc., as pathways to the inner self, definitely. In fact, all of us do need time to pause. We've got to take a time out every day. I mean, people suffer from compassion fatigue. You know, being lovely to everyone all the time is a very wearing thing, and we need a bit of time out. You know, it's not all about being interconnected. It's also about needing to take time alone, whether in meditation or in some other form of solitude, or time to, you know, kick a football or sing in a choir or read a book or something, to replenish the resources we need for being a fully fledged, paid up member of this compassionate species.
Well, Hugh McKay, thank you very, very much for your time tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating to actually see you face to face. One day I will get into the same room as you. I'll chat to you a little bit later, because I'm going to send you and your dear wife a bottle of red wine, because you see we're a wine centre, and we feel like we should in South Australia, because we're so well looked after here. I mean, we have no active cases here because we've shut our border, and we do feel sorry for the Victorians. You're not a Victorian, but you're a little further away. But we will send a care package of a bottle of wine to keep you through this pandemic. A nice red would do, would it?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Barney. That's fine.
And look, go down to Collins Booksellers, The Inner Self, and also The Question of Love. And in fact, your other books, if asked for, they will be able to get them for you. And you have got actually another one in the pipeline.
Yes, there's always another one on the go. So it's under wraps, but
good. That's all I want to know. In other words, there is an actual legitimate reason, other than because you're a good guy, to get us actually here, actually in the library with that next one, which we can't talk about yet.
That'd be wonderful. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
God bless. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll sign off from the Mount Gambier Library. And again, thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Barney, for a very entertaining night. We have had some threads come through of thanking Hugh for his time, and Barney, and just saying what a wonderful, insightful evening it is. So thank you for sending those messages through. Stay safe, everyone, as Barney said, and we hopefully will see you all in person in the library very soon. Thank you. Bye for now.